all of it when you first put it on, because I'm just going to talk it all through together rather than me. I mean, if you forget, I'll just be like, can you click?
No, yeah. Nicole, shall we share screen now?
Yes, you can do that.
Great, thanks. Okay, we might, we're still waiting for some more people to join the webinar. We're just keeping an eye on numbers, but we might just get started, and this will be recorded and be on the YouTube channel for the BDD Foundation a bit later. So if anybody's missed the beginning, please do join there. So we'll just start with some introductions. My name's Amita Jassi, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work in the National Specialist Clinic for young people with OCD, BDD and related disorders.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Peile. I'm also a clinical psychologist and I work in the same team as Amita. Evening everybody.
So thank you so much for joining us. We decided to do this session just because we know this is a time when people might be at different points of their journey with their CBT. And what we've tried to do with this presentation is try and gauge it at different levels. So some people may still be accessing their CBT remotely. So I know, for example, in our clinic, we're managing to offer treatment via video calls. So we're seeing how effective that is. So it's some of what we're talking about today is tailored for that group. We know for some people maybe treatment is being put on hold because of service restrictions and because of lockdown at the moment. So this is an opportunity just to think about how to carry on that work whilst CBT might be on hold. And I guess we've also tried to gauge this for people who may not be accessing CBT at the moment. You might be on a wait list for CBT, or you may have had CBT in the past. So we're doing a bit of a refresher, just picking out some of the essential things about CBT and focusing a bit more on some of the elements that you could perhaps be working on during lockdown. We just kind of wanted to say before we start that when we're talking about ideas of things to be doing during lockdown, just to try and take a compassionate approach when hearing some of these ideas and thoughts from us and other people, because we want this to be really interactive, that actually at a time when we're all feeling incredibly anxious and there's so much uncertainty, we do have to be compassionate and kind to ourselves, and we can only do so much as we can all manage. So when we're talking about some of the ideas, they are just ideas. It's really important to try and do what feels kind of right for you, and even small steps, kind of daily, small steps is something. And maybe the focus for you at the moment is perhaps not trying to make progress in challenging BDD. It may be just trying to keep things from getting worse, or trying to keep things stable. So we hope that sort of the ideas we come up with will be helpful regardless of where you are in your journey with CBT, but also how you're feeling about challenging BDD at this really sort of anxious time for us all. We just wanted to highlight there's a Q&A function that's either at the top or bottom of your screen, and we really would like this to be interactive. So what's quite nice about this webinar is we haven't got lots and lots of people. We've got a nice number of people that there'll be opportunities throughout to either ask Lauren and I questions as we go through, or if you've got ideas, there'll be various points we'll stop and share, sort of ask for ideas, just to pop those on there. We just want to let you know that Lauren and I will be the only ones, and Nicole, who's helping us with the technical side, will be the only ones that can read those comments, questions, reflections. So it is confidential. And it's a way, I guess, if you want us to share some of your ideas with other people in this webinar, that we can read them out to other people. So in a confidential way. So that's just a bit of context and a bit of kind of housekeeping for today. And we hope this webinar is helpful for you, regardless of where you're at in your treatment. So just thinking about what we're going to cover today. So as I said, we just are going to cover a bit about what CBT for BDD looks like, you know, whether you've had it before, whether you're new to it, just to get an idea. Thinking about considerations for receiving CBT remotely. So if you are receiving it, just some ideas and some things that we're picking up on when we're delivering treatment on the other side, that we've kind of been sharing with the young people we work with about what we find helpful and what we think might be helpful for you to consider when you're receiving the treatment. As I said, we'll be thinking about, if you're not having regular sessions at the moment, how to continue this work and when you're not receiving it. And I guess what the bulk of what we'd like to talk about, and I know Rob talked about this in his webinar last week, which is available on our YouTube channel, it's just some ideas that people have shared with us and things we're doing in our sessions. We're trying to do exposures and behavioural experiments during lockdown. There are lots of challenges in that, but actually lots of opportunities as well. So just a reminder of what CBT for BDD incorporates. So when you start CBT, you'd spend some time doing psychoeducation and developing a formulation, and that's, you know, something you would do with a therapist most typically. And the bulk of the work is around behavioural experiments and exposure work, which we're going to be talking about today. This isn't neglecting that there's so many other elements to treatment, but I guess what we're focusing on in this webinar is think about the things you could quite, I wouldn't say easily, but things that are probably a bit easier to implement when you're not kind of going to sessions or going into clinics. So things that you could do in your day-to-day life. There are things like mirror retraining, lots of work around attention refocusing. Again, check out Rob's webinar from last week, where he's talked about a lot of ideas about how to do that. Thinking about sort of challenging thoughts. There's lots of other elements to this, but we're focusing on these two elements today. And then finally, relapse prevention. So I'm handing over to Lauren now.
So we're aware that for some of you, you'll be really familiar with exposures and what they are and what they're about, but we wanted to give you a quick summary so that we're all on the same page. So when we talk about ERP, or exposure response prevention, this is very much about the idea of facing the fear, doing the thing that anxiety makes it really difficult to do. But while we're doing that, this response prevention bit is really important. It's a really key ingredient. And that's where we simultaneously fight the action or the compulsion or the safety behavior, however we describe it, that we're doing to try and reduce our anxiety. So that combination of going into the situation which we fear, and simultaneously not doing the behavior that we would usually be doing to try and reduce our anxiety, is the really key kind of basic fundamental principle of the ERP. So why do we do this? Why do we ask you to do something that we know is going to make you feel really anxious? And I guess the main reason is what we know about anxiety. And we've learned this from lots of different conditions, which are very much anxiety driven, but also from lots of research into BDD. So we know that anxiety over time, if left alone, without doing any behaviors to try and reduce it, kind of goes up, doesn't go on infinitely, it plateaus and then slowly comes down again. And that's what happens to anxiety if you don't do behaviors, if you don't try to reduce the anxiety, if you don't try to suppress it. The other thing, another really important thing that we know about anxiety, and this is something that I guess we all know intuitively with any situation that we go into, is that the more times we do things, the less anxious it makes us. So if we think about non-BDD examples, it would be things like, you know, your first day at school on the Monday morning, you're really anxious. By the time it gets to Friday, you're usually finding it a bit easier. And, you know, there's all sorts of examples that we might think about. But often people don't think of their anxiety in relation to BDD in the same way. And we think the reason for that is probably because the urge to do the safety behaviours and the compulsions is so strong. You don't actually have an opportunity ordinarily to see what happens to that anxiety over time if you don't do anything. And that's understandable. It's really distressing. So the thing that we try to do in CBT in relation to exposures is we really try really hard to sit with that anxiety and not do anything to try and get rid of it. So there's three really important benefits to doing exposure work. So the first one, I guess, is what I've already talked about, this idea that we get to find out what happens to anxiety over time when we don't try to reduce it. And that starts to shift this relationship that we have with anxiety. It starts to reduce its power and its fuel in keeping the BDD cycle going. So it's really important and fundamental. The other thing we also get to do is we get to learn different things. So for all of the time that we are carrying out behaviours and we're driven by this anxiety, we don't necessarily learn everything that we could be learning in situations. So for example, you know, if we go into a shop, but we've got a hat down over our face and we're avoiding eye contact, we may even not be able to speak to the shopkeeper because we don't want to draw attention to ourselves. What happens is that our beliefs never really get challenged. We don't really get to find out whether people are looking at us with disgust or, you know, how we are going to be treated. And so all of that kind of inner perception gets to run riot, really. There's no real challenging that happens. And then the third part, which is probably one of the most important parts, is that we can start to reclaim our lives from BDD. So the kind of things we might be challenging ourselves with in terms of exposure, the things that we actually want to be doing. So the young people we work with, we might be trying to help them to get back into school because they want to get qualifications and they want to have driving lessons, or they want to go on holiday or see their friends. And so these exposures, you know, they're meaningful exposures that target the things that people want to be doing to get their lives back on track and to build their self-esteem and to be having the experiences that they want to be having. So this is how it works. Again, I realise for some of you this is probably really familiar stuff, but I mean, the important thing, that hierarchy, so that this point number one, this idea of having a hierarchy or a list or a ladder of behaviours, that's really key. And the important thing is that's tailored to the individual. So as a therapist, I would never assume the order in which people would place the situations that they're going into. So, you know, one person's most anxiety provoking situations may not be the same as the next person. So this idea of creating a hierarchy is really important and is our kind of framework for how we then go about gradually experiencing the exposures through the process of CBT. Then when we get to the actual designing of an exposure task, so we've chosen where on our hierarchy we're working. We always would start with the least anxiety provoking behaviour, or that not doing creates the least anxiety, I should say. And then when we go into it, you know, being a real stickler for detail, really meticulously making sure you plan, right, what are we going to do? And the reason for doing that is because if you don't, BDD tries to wangle its way in often and will try to, you know, change the rules halfway through or make things difficult. So really kind of pinning down really clearly and predictably what the exposure task is going to be. Where am I going to sit? Where am I going to be looking? What am I going to be wearing? What's the lighting going to be like? You know, making sure that's pitched at a level that feels just about manageable. It's going to make you feel a bit anxious, but it's not going to make you feel overwhelmingly anxious. And then choose something that you can do for a long enough amount of time to be able to see what happens to anxiety. So ideally something you can sit with for say half an hour. Obviously to begin with, you might want to start with a smaller amount of time, but you know, we want to have enough time to actually almost scientifically measure what happens to anxiety over time. And then find out what we learn about anxiety, what we learn about what happens in that situation. And the repetition is a really key point as well. You know, doing it once, we might learn something, but we're not really going to learn what we need to about anxiety unless we practice it again and again. Because if you remember, the second part of that graph was about what happens repetitively over time. So yeah, that's the really key things. So this slide, now this might be where people want to contribute. So these are some of the things that we wanted to draw attention to in terms of what can be helpful and what's not so helpful. So we've talked about, or I've talked about being collaborative and, you know, making sure each person has an opportunity to really design their own hierarchy and their own kind of process of things that they want to work on. It's really important that you know, you try not to do the safety behaviours and the really even subtle things that you might really be tempted to do to reduce your anxiety, because as soon as you start doing that, you're losing your ability to find out what happens to anxiety if you don't do anything. And that's the key bit in the exposure. Remember, focusing externally, again, it's going to be really tempting to be kind of really focused on what's going on inwardly for you and the perceptions you're having and the assumptions you're making, and kind of really trying to work out whether things feel safe or not. But as much as you can, it's focusing on what's going on around you, and trying not to get too bogged down in that inner experience during the exposure task. Rewards, it says especially with young people, but I think everybody likes rewards. That, you know, that's part of being kind to yourself as well, part of saying, you know, I've done well, and being proud and taking some real confidence in what you've managed to achieve. Breaking it down, making sure that you don't take too big a jump. It's really tempting to kind of push yourself and really try to go for it and show that you can do it, but actually it's often important to just take those small chunks and to do it gradually, so that you get to really experience the reduction in anxiety without feeling like you need to do extra behaviours to reduce it. And then the practice, doing it again and again and again. The more you practice, the more times a week that you're able to repeat the task, the more you're likely to see the benefit. So the less helpful things that we identified were, I think I've already said this, going too hard on yourself and then experiencing that backlash and feeling overwhelmed and then feeling really awful and self-critical because you've not managed to achieve it. But also the likelihood is you'll probably find yourself doing safety behaviours and things to try and bring the anxiety down because the anxiety is too high, and then you kind of lose that opportunity to see that reduction in anxiety. And as I said, the self-focused attention. So we're not going to go into that too much today, but that's the important process of moving away from self-focused attention and actually taking in more of what's going in around you. Just looking to see if we've got any Q&As.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions that have come up, but I guess it's also an opportunity for people to share what they found helpful and not helpful in exposure, and just their experience. I don't know if we'll wait a couple of seconds and see. Sorry, I'm messing around with these slides. If anybody's got things that they would like to share. So we've got okay, so I think we've got a couple of questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to also, I should say we're sort of running through these slides because somebody's just given some feedback that we're running through it quite quickly. I think we wanted to come into some practical aspects a bit later on. So some of these slides have a lot of information, I should have said at the beginning, and we've kind of purposefully put quite a lot of information on the slides, so they're there in case you would like to come back to them. But actually what we'll say is probably going to be briefly going over them, so we're not just reading from the slides. So I don't know, Lauren, if you could see some of the questions.
So the first question is about how to engage somebody who's too scared to do an experiment. And I guess there's probably a couple of different answers to this. I think what Amita said at the beginning is really important, which is actually at the moment, it might feel that with anxiety levels generally really high and with life kind of turned upside down as it is for so many people, and probably all of us, it might well be that actually that's okay if doing exposure at the moment feels too difficult. But I think more generally, I would go back to that really important process of the grading and the taking really small steps. And sometimes, you know, it can feel like really, really tiny steps. You know, it can feel like something that's only slightly different to what's already happening, but it starts the ball rolling. And I think that's the real key, I would say. And I don't know if anyone else wants to comment if they have anything from their own experience of kind of how they took that initial step and started doing exposure work. But I would usually go back to the drawing board and say, well, how can we break it down more? How can we take a step backwards and get to the point where it feels manageable? And simultaneously, you know, in having, you know, that motivation. Are we choosing a task that's actually motivating enough? Is it something that someone really wants to achieve, or is it something that's actually more about what the therapist we think they should be doing or what their parents want them to do? So that can be another thing that sometimes can be enough to really, you know, help people to take what is essentially a terrifying step. You know, there's no doubt about it. It's going to be incredibly difficult.
And I guess, Lauren, so in our work, we do sort of often find as well that often there's quite a lot of beliefs about anxiety. As well, so the distress and the disgust and the kind of, you know, the upset and sadness that comes with doing some of these tasks, there's often some underlying beliefs. So it could be, as Lauren said, it's just a matter of sort of breaking it down, linking it to meaningful goals to try and get people to do it. But sometimes, even if that doesn't work, we sometimes explore that a little bit in therapy. So sometimes we have people that have like a fear that anxiety is really dangerous or it's never going to stop, and there might be something else kind of getting in the way of that. That often in therapy it's a bit easier to explore that and kind of address that. And I guess when we'll come on to the next section about behavioural experiments, I guess just thinking about what the predictions are, because there might be these really big catastrophic predictions that they're making about going out and doing these exposure tasks, whether it's about the feelings or what they think is going to happen as a consequence. And just understanding that a little bit more might be helpful to then think about how to go about doing the exposure. So they're kind of things we would often think about, wouldn't they, in the work that we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. There's another question which is around, I guess, understanding some of the meaning behind behaviours and the meaning behind beliefs. And I don't know, Amita, probably you're going to go on to think about this a little bit, but it may well be that this particular kind of session that we've got is slightly beyond the scope of what we've got time to talk about today. But hopefully some of that question will be answered in the thinking about behavioural experiments and the meaning and the learning that can be taken.
Yeah, so I guess a really important thing that we haven't gone into detail, you know, because we just want to focus on sort of more practical things that could be done in the context of lockdown, is you would be developing a formulation with your therapist to really understand, you know, looking at your early experiences and understanding what experiences might have led you to develop some of the beliefs about appearance and the importance of appearance, but also making sense of the experiences you've had. And yes, they could be addressed in behavioural experiments, which we'll come on to next, where you sort of think about some of those traumatic experiences and what you're making predictions about in the here and now. And then sometimes other techniques might be used in the context of treatment. So we're not talking about what to do in lockdown, but things like imagery rescripting and going back to some of those traumatic experiences and using a technique to try and rescript some of, if it's really traumatic. So there are techniques that could be used. So I would say kind of formulation, using that formulation and understanding of how this developed, then think about experiments and exposures. But there are other techniques that can also support people to try and process some of, if they have really traumatic memories, to try and sort of support them to understand that and kind of move forward and then be able to do kind of exposures and behavioural experiments.
We've actually got another question. Should I answer this question now, Amita, or we both can?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. So this is somebody asking about, you know, whether or not they explain they've taken lots of small steps, but they haven't yet got to that kind of final goal that they have with regards to their BDD behaviours. And the question is about, can they do this bit without a therapist? Can they do this bit on their own? I think it's a really good question. I mean, I suppose, I mean, Amita might want to say something else. I would say that actually the process of CBT is very much about skilling up individuals to have the understanding of the importance of kind of approaching BDD behaviours in a particular way. And the idea is that, you know, we kind of anticipate that BDD is going to kind of throw up some other things in the future. It potentially, you know, might move to a different area. There might be a stressful time in your life, and there might be a need to actually use the strategies that you've used previously. So what I would hope is that if you've been able to take away the principles and the things that work for you in terms of CBT, that actually I wouldn't see any reason that you wouldn't be able to continue in the same way and work through any kind of remaining goals that you have on your own. And I suppose the caveat is that for some people, actually doing that without support is really hard. And it may well be that might feel too overwhelming, particularly at the moment, or it may well feel that actually it's something that you would like to kind of re-engage with a therapist to have a look at. But I would say in principle, the idea is actually the therapist is there, I always think, almost as a coach. And you know, there's no reason why you can't go out and do training on your own without your coach. So yeah, I don't want to minimize how distressing it can be to do things without support, but actually I certainly wouldn't say there's a reason you shouldn't do it, as long as you can keep those principles in mind, like things like the safety behaviors and the things that might be undermining the benefits of the exposure. Amita, did you have anything?
No, I completely agree. I think that ethos of definitely, you know, you're co-working and it's about skilling up people to know what to do is really important. But I totally agree, Lauren, just acknowledging those final steps can be really scary, and it sounds like this person's doing incredibly well with all the steps they've taken so far. So in a way, you know, you could draw on that and say, well, I've done, you know, those early steps must have been really hard, and even I'm sure there's been setbacks along the way, you've overcome them, and there's no reason why you couldn't do, you know, do the last bit. But equally, we are in a very unusual context, and some people, you know, need support. And also, I think when you're doing the sort of the ultimate task of not wearing makeup or not having any camouflage, that could feel really difficult. So that's what therapists are there just to support you with. I know there's lots of other questions that have popped up, but I might just run through a couple of more slides and then maybe we'll take another pause, because I think some of it might be addressed in the next slides. But I guess now we're just kind of move along. It's a bit of a more technical thing, but just thinking about what the difference is between kind of behavioural experiments and exposure. And I think I'm sure Lauren would agree, sort of in our work, we kind of don't see them as two necessarily separate things, that actually when you're doing exposures, there are opportunities there to test out some of your predictions and beliefs that might be maintaining your difficulty. So Lauren's already talked about that, sort of making predictions and what have you learned. I guess with behavioural experiments, there's kind of a less of an emphasis on this, the process of habituation, anxiety habituating. And I guess why that's important is because actually it's not always possible, and not always, it doesn't always happen that anxiety would habituate. So some of the situations where I've noticed that is when you're out in social situations, you might constantly be triggered by things. So you don't get that anxiety habituation, and that the more you do it, it gets, you do to a certain extent, but you wouldn't get that nice kind of flow. And I think you usually find that more with the private kind of BDD behaviors, like things like reducing checking in mirrors and so forth. And also, I guess, we're talking a lot about anxiety, but there's other emotions that come along with experiencing BDD, like disgust and sadness and so forth. So actually, there might be less of a focus on sort of just anxiety habituating. It may be more about testing out some of the predictions and beliefs. And this is where a formulation and doing theory A, theory B is really important to try and set those up. So if you're in therapy, you would be thinking about that together with your therapist and really pinning down what you'd be testing out and being really specific. So all the things Lauren's mentioned about looking out for subtle BDD behaviours, just to ensure it's a fair experiment, doing things to make sure, you know, it's triggering the BDD, and that you're trying to drop some of the behaviours, are kind of done in a way that it is regarded as a fair experiment, so that when you come to the end of it, the evidence you've gathered feels like it's valid. And it could be, you could do a range of experiments, and this doesn't necessarily get restricted because of lockdown, and we're going to be thinking about that a bit later, but you might be making predictions about how people respond to you, or if you don't use your normal safety seeking behaviours, what might happen. And that might be about anxiety, that you feel like you might feel overwhelmed and you wouldn't be able to manage. It could be just other people might notice or react. And as I said, it's kind of acknowledging how you think you might cope with that. So it's just, I guess, I don't know if Lauren agrees, I see it as more of a continuum. They're kind of not, it's one or the other. I think you can kind of weave in both, that you could be thinking about anxiety habituating or making predictions, or both. So it's being really clear on sort of what is the rationale for what you're doing and what are you testing out. So just a bit more about that. So an example might be somebody, you know, that I worked with, or we worked with, said, you know, if I don't wear my hat, people make negative comments about my appearance. So you would really set out how to test this out and what kind of situations might trigger those thoughts. And then what you would usually do in therapy, but there's no reason why you can't give this a go yourself, is to think about what you've learned and whether that's altered the strength of your belief. So when you do theory A, theory B in the formulation, you would kind of measure how strongly you believe kind of theory A and theory B, and you would kind of look at that again after the evidence, and then you would take that forward. So I guess what's a little bit different with exposure and behaviour experiments is you might not have to keep repeating the behaviour experiment once you've gathered that evidence, although repetition is good. I guess with ERP there is more of an emphasis on keep doing it in exactly the same way, because you would habituate. But if it's not about anxiety or distress that you're measuring and you're testing out predictions, like try to do it as much as you can, just to kind of gather as much evidence for that kind of other alternative theory, and to ensure that you've got enough evidence to kind of start shifting some of those beliefs. So it's just, for me, I see it as just a slight shift in emphasis in the work that you're doing, but actually ultimately it all comes down to trying to face situations that might trigger your BDD and trying to drop safety seeking behaviours, either to learn something about your distress and or about predictions, about what you think might happen. And that could be a range of things, whether it's about sort of your distress, or whether it's about how other people might react, how you might cope. There could be any predictions, and it has to be really tailored to the individual. It's not like a formula that's just like one size fits all. It's very kind of linked with your own formulation and your understanding of BDD. So we are going to, I'm just checking the next slide, just thinking about if you are having treatment at the moment with a therapist and thinking about having that remotely. But I wonder if we should just pause for a minute just to see if there's further questions related to what Lauren and I have already covered. So I'm just going to get questions up. So I don't know where we got to.
So I think the next one that we haven't yet spoken about is in terms of if you're doing an exposure and then something happens. So in this case, you know, a negative comment is made. How do you move forward from that? You know, if something really distressing like that happens during the exposure. And I see that, Amita, as perhaps coming into that whole how we're setting up the behavioural experiment in the first place, and what we're testing and what we're considering fair evidence and meaningful evidence, and what isn't. Because I think if that hasn't been kind of really clearly thought about before you do the exposure, this, you know, this kind of, I mean, in this example, I guess there may be quite a clear thing that has felt really distressing, but actually even without comments from other people, you might actually still feel that things are happening that are really traumatic or really scary during the exposure. And I suppose what we're really wanting to do is to say, what are we testing and how are we testing that? How are we making a decision about that evidence? And actually, if somebody makes a comment, we don't necessarily know what's driving that comment. We don't, you know, we're looking at what's the consequence of that? What's the thing we're actually testing? So if we're testing that people aren't going to want to be near me and no one's ever going to want to be near me again, is one person's comment evidence for that? So it really kind of hinges on what we're actually testing and how we kind of fairly weigh up that evidence. And I know, again, it might be that we're getting into quite specific details, and hopefully this is kind of making sense for everybody. But I guess what it would come down to, and I suppose if you haven't really ironed that out before you go into an exposure, there is this kind of possibility that things are going to be feeling as though they're slightly derailing the process.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's about how it's set up and that kind of detail. And, you know, we're not sort of going in saying people never make negative comments, like things are said, and that would be, you know, that's where it has to be a fair experiment, and just thinking about the kind of the meaning. And, you know, and this is where I think sort of challenging, you know, I think setting up experiments in a really sort of detailed way is really important. But I guess also with a therapist, you would think that through about sort of alternatives, explanations for why that comment might have been made, and also weighing it up with the evidence that might have been one comment, but actually what else happened in that experiment, and what could be the reasons for that comment other than not wearing, you know, reducing safety seeking behaviour. So I guess that's where a therapist is quite helpful, because you would try and weigh that up a bit more. So I agree. I think sort of the detail of the behaviour experiments, but also trying to any evidence you gather, it has to be balanced, and thinking that through together with therapists would be really important. We've got a couple of other questions. So somebody's sort of mentioned here about CBT being sort of put around a short time frame, and why can't it be done in long-term therapy? And I think that's really interesting. I think it's Lauren, if I give this go and you can add, I guess I sort of pick, because Lauren's kind of answered this already, but I guess the idea behind CBT is very much about sort of training up and for you to become your own therapist. And that's kind of the idea that, you know, I know in our clinic, for example, we have like a set protocol around how many sessions, but, you know, we would extend that, and we would consider kind of adapting that to the individual. But kind of the rationale behind CBT, and that's what CBT is known for, is about trying to support people to get a better understanding of the processes that are involved in whatever difficulty they're experiencing, giving them tools on how to overcome that, but, you know, really trying to support somebody in becoming their own therapist, so that in the future, when you have setbacks and you have things that come up, that you're well equipped to deal with that. That's not to say, I mean, the evidence is, you know, for BDD is CBT. There are alternative longer term therapies available, but the evidence for that is kind of less. But I don't know what you think, Lauren. I think that's kind of my view of why it's more of a shorter term therapy, because the whole kind of drive of CBT is very much about a person becoming confident in knowing what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the other thing is that often BDD can sit alongside other difficulties. So for example, people may have really low mood, really low self-esteem, or may have had some really traumatic things happen to them in the past. And I suppose what we're really focusing it on is the behaviours and the kind of cycle of BDD specifically. But obviously for some people their journey may include some other aspects and other kinds of support, and for some of those difficulties there might be other types of therapy which perhaps are kind of longer lasting. So we are really focusing in on the BDD behaviours in particular, and actually giving people the skills to tackle those in their own way, and that then means that they can rebuild their lives, develop different relationships, have things going, that improve the quality of their life, with the hope that that actually has an overall positive benefit on them. But for some people there may be a need to do some other longer lasting pieces of work around other experiences that they've had.
Yeah. So we've got some other, thank you so much for everybody for your questions and comments. It's exactly what Lauren and I wanted, was it to be interactive and not for us just to be running through slides. So somebody is really, bravely sharing some of their appearance concerns to do with skin and eyelashes. And it's kind of asking whether it's reasonable still to wear makeup to cover this up. And I guess it's a difficult question to answer, because I guess it depends on, where you're at in your journey and what your goals are, whether that's something you want to work towards and what sort of driving that behavior. So, if it's kind of part of BDD and that's something if there's predictions that you would make, if you didn't wear makeup and so forth, then it might be something that you may wish to work on. It's not, I guess, for us to say, what you should work on or not. But I guess also is think about whether that's something you're ready to do, and if that's something you think you would like to work towards. Because I guess when people come to treatment, it isn't for us to kind of say you should be working on this and not. I guess it's just thinking about what might be distressing and interfering in your life, and is it getting in the way of things that you would like to do? Is it taking up lots of time? Is it something that you wish you didn't have to do? And therefore I guess it'd be for you to think about whether that feels unreasonable and something you want to challenge. And then of course CBT and therapists are there to support kind of your meaningful goals. I don't know, Lauren, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I think no, I completely agree. I think yeah.
And then we've got somebody else who's shared that they're having some treatment for eating disorder prior to BDD, and it feels really hard at the moment to do exposure work since they've put on weight. And I guess I was just, when I read that, I was reflecting that's often what we would do in our clinic, that if somebody had issues with eating, we would always prioritize kind of that, because that's what kind of has the implications for health and so forth. And it is understandable, I guess, if your body changes as a result, that would bring up more anxiety in a different way, particularly as this person shared that their kind of concerns are around particular areas of their body where they may have put on weight. And I can so it feels like it's impossible. And I guess I would come back to what Lauren said about thinking about breaking that down, and also what that exposure work would look like, but acknowledging that of course you've also been through a change in your body, which there's an adjustment period to that. But yeah, I think, thank you for sharing that. But I think some of those ideas that Lauren mentioned earlier about really breaking things down, trying to think about where your goals are, what do you want to get to, and sort of thinking about steps that, they don't have to be big steps. I think any step in challenging and dropping a safety behaviour, even if it's just delaying a safety behaviour or just trying to do something slightly different, is a massive achievement. So I'm sorry if it feels impossible at the moment, but hopefully with the support of some therapy, or for you to kind of think through where do you like to get to, and just breaking that down, and just every little bit counts, I think. And the fact that you've managed to overcome an eating disorder, I think in itself just shows that resilience, and the fact that there's lots of things you are able to overcome, and perhaps that might be helpful in your sort of journey with challenging BDD. Laura, I don't know if you wanted to kind of add anything to that.
No, not at all. I'd absolutely agree. I mean, I think it's always that tension, isn't it, between the different kind of difficulties that people have. But as you say, we do usually focus on things that are going to be really important for your well-being, and also making sure you're healthy and have the energy that you need to do CBT. So I think probably that's the sort of the approach that we would definitely take. But yeah, it sounds as though you're coming along your journey, and it's working out when you're ready. I think possibly sometimes there is a period of adjustment and a period of having breaks between therapies as well that can be really important if it's feeling like a bit too much straight away.
Definitely. And sometimes when you've had treatment for one thing, you might just need a little bit of a break. So often, you know, we would say to people not to have like 2 courses of treatment back to back or like alongside each other, because actually, you know, treatment's tough, it's exhausting and challenging. And maybe it's just like Lauren said, having a period of adjustment, but also maybe just having a little bit of time just to kind of get used to sort of this new way, and then thinking about what you'd want to challenge thereafter. So we've got a couple of other comments. They're quite specific about CBT. I might just come back to them just to give people opportunity to add a few more questions as we go along. I guess what we're to move on to now is a bit more about practicality. So please do feel free to share anything about sort of your specific treatment. But I guess we've been really reflecting in our work because we've moved very quickly to remote working, which, you know, I think on the whole we think is going well, but I think there are challenges, you know, for example, being on camera, you know, just the kind of connections and things. But also I think there are things that we're sort of learning as we go along that we thought it'd be helpful to share. And they sound really obvious now, but actually it took us a while to kind of get into this. So it's really interesting when we're delivering treatment remotely, because you're often in your home environment, or you may be sort of, you know, often it's in the home environment because we're all kind of stuck at home at the moment. And lots of people have found it quite challenging to find a really private and quiet space for sessions. So some people I'm working with, they can only use the living room and they've got family around. And I think that's really important, because what we're trying to think about when we're delivering treatment remotely is to try and replicate what it would be like if you came into clinic. So you would have a confidential space, you wouldn't have people walking in and out of that space, you would have kind of that one-to-one time with your therapist. So as much as possible trying to find that. If you do live with other people, maybe consider whether you can sort of just say, look, for the next hour I just kind of need this room cleared, do you mind sort of staying away? Because what we wouldn't want is for people not to be utilizing and making the most of that time that they have with that therapist for that hour a week, and for things to get in the way. So actually, we've now drawn up a document with the young people we work with, just to say things like this, because actually it seems quite obvious, but I've had people like parents walking into the room, and or they're sort of like holding back a little bit because they think somebody's outside and they're not able to open up about some really distressing things. So I think just try and mimic as much as possible what it would be like to come into the clinic, and try and share that with people, if you feel comfortable sort of at home about that's something you need to do sort of for that hour a week. Again, I know it sounds a really obvious thing, but actually at the beginning of the remote working, we just spent so much time just like going, hello, for like half an hour of the session. So actually just being prepared. So what we're trying to do is test calls with people in advance of the session. So when you're having your session, you're straight on, like when you would come into the clinic, making sure like software works. So actually, even for this webinar, we were on early it was me that messed up, pressing the wrong link, but actually that meant that we were ready for the webinar. But just check in those things, because that can just add an extra layer of anxiety and stress that's unnecessary. Some of us have recommended maybe using a device you can carry around, so the mobile phones and so forth, particularly if you were coming into clinic, we'd be going out with you, we'd be doing experiments. So try to get a device that you could go out and walk with is quite a helpful thing, we feel, so long as you still have that confidentiality. I guess it's the same as if you were coming into clinic, you would be walking around talking to your therapist. So putting your earphones in sort of, and putting the phone away, or being able to see on the phone, so that you can actually do experiments in the same way as you would be doing in the clinic. I think what I've really noticed is at the moment it's really hard also for people to know how to contact us, because I guess we're not in clinic at the moment, and that can feel quite scary or kind of really unsettling, that should something come up that you wanted to contact your therapist about, how do I contact them? So it's really important to talk to your therapist about how you can contact them out of session. So for example, we have an email address that we have that people can contact us on, and that goes to central email. So there's always somebody around. But I think also saying that, if you, it's also making sure you've got a good sort of risk management plan as well around that, because your therapist might not be able to manage that. But do you know in the current context, if you're feeling quite low or you need somebody kind of in more of an emergency, do you have a plan around kind of managing some of those difficult and distressing times when potentially a therapist is not available? And I kind of raise this because I think it is a very unusual time, and some of the usual things you might do, like calling A&E, wouldn't apply in the same way. So I know in our trust, for example, we have sort of a crisis line now that's set up because you're not allowed to take yourself to A&E. So just making yourself aware of those things, just to keep yourself safe, and also, you know, so that you know where you can contact people. And I guess the camera aspect of video calls is something that has been really challenging for lots of people that, you know, we're working with, understandably. But we're sort of really encouraging people to try and you know, use Skype and Zoom as much as possible, but just to do whatever feels comfortable for them to help them engage. So for some people, they're just turning the camera off completely and just keeping it audio, or, you know, they might be dimming the lights. It's just doing what makes you feel kind of less uncomfortable, but also I guess that also would give you room for something to work towards in treatment. So it's just do whatever you can at the moment to kind of get, you know, engage in sessions. But also, if you're noticing it is difficult, which for lots of people it is, just making sure that is put in your kind of therapy and exposure plan to try and address. It's an opportunity there in lots of ways to try and work on that. So those are just some of the things that there's lots of other things we notice, but I think my main sort of message is, if you are fortunate enough to be getting treatment remotely, just try and make it as much like being in the clinic as possible, because there are reasons for why we have confidential space and so forth. And, you know, all of these kind of hints and tips does just help it run more smoothly. And believe me, we've learnt the hard way after a few weeks of kind of having problems. And then I guess we also want to consider people who are not getting sessions at the moment. Now, this maybe you haven't even started, you might be on a wait list, or there's been a gap, or you've had treatment, it's stopped, or you've never had treatment. And I guess we were just thinking about, well, how could you sort of make time or kind of make it feel like you're having treatment? And I guess you know, it's trying again to try and mimic what it would be like if you were having CBT sessions. So, you know, giving yourself time once a week to review how things have been going, setting up tasks for the week ahead, what are the exposure tasks, what are the behavioural experiments, what's your plan? Maybe getting somebody else involved in that process, because I always find it more helpful to kind of be talking out loud to somebody rather than sort of just coming up with things myself. So, you know, if you do have somebody you trust in your support circle, just to perhaps have that conversation with them, have that time set aside. You know, it doesn't have to be once a week, it could be more than that, just to really think through, review how your week's been, what's been difficult, what's gone well, what's the plan, what tools are you going to use, what tasks are you going to do sort of moving ahead. And also, I guess, trying to use materials that you have used in sessions, access other materials. So I've put David and Rob's book there, which is fantastic as a self-help guide. So if you do feel like you're in the place where you do want to try and challenge some of your BDD, or you want to get on top of some of the BDD that might be you know, getting worse because of lockdown and all the anxiety that comes with it, perhaps accessing some materials like that. And I guess just to remind you, and, you know, the fact that you're on this webinar is fantastic in itself, because you are accessing support, but there's lots of other support available with the BDD Foundation. So there's online support groups, there's webinars, there's the structured support group. So do just go to this link, that there's other ways to try and access that support, where people would be talking about what you could be challenging. And, you know, the structured support groups that we do that have moved online do use a CBT framework. So there are opportunities, even if you're not getting that formal CBT with a therapist once a week, there are opportunities to access some of, you know, similar support out there. So that's to kind of cover, if you're getting treatment remotely, just some practicalities, but also if you're not, for whatever reason, things that you could be doing. I just wondered, Lauren, whether it's time just for a bit of a pause before we move on, just for some more questions. Although, having said that, it's 10:02 all of a sudden. I've just looked at the time and I can't believe it's that. I wondered whether maybe we can move on to some of the kind of ideas for exposures in lockdown, and then if we have the opportunity, we'll try and answer those last few questions. We've just got a couple more slides. Would that be okay? So we might move on from... So, yeah, well, I don't know if people want to share ideas of exposures that they've done. I don't know if people already have, just having a look. Okay.
If not, we might we might end up talking about some of the things that we've been doing with people that we work with.
Yeah, should we do that?
Shall I kick off, Amita, and you can interrupt me as we go through?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
So this is one of those things, you know, I think we've already said this is a strange time. This is an anxiety-provoking time. Not everybody is wanting or able to push on and to keep doing their exposure work, but we do have young people, in our case, we're working with young people in our clinic who are actually saying, you know what, I'm not at school at the moment, my family are at home, my parents aren't at work, I've got lots of support around. For them, actually, it is feeling appropriate. And for those people, we've had various things. We spoke to some of our colleagues as well. So this is kind of an amalgamation of various people that we're working with. And these are some of the ideas, the things we've come up with. So we've all got this exercise time, this time outside of the house that's mandated, that we're all allowed to have. And for some people, they're using that to work on some of their avoidance behaviours. So they might be making sure that they walk down you know, busier roads, which are getting increasingly busy in London. I don't know where about elsewhere. They might think about, you know, how long they spend getting ready before they go out and try to reduce that. They might be wearing less kind of baggy clothes. They might, you know, I'm working with someone who's kind of managing to reduce the kind of camouflage in that respect and the amount of clothing that they wear over the top. So for them, they're actually able to incorporate it into that time they spend outside. So I suppose the caveat there is thinking about how you use that time and what's important about that time for you, because I suppose what we want to kind of emphasize is that if for your well-being, you need to have some kind of time out of the house, which feels kind of relaxing and affirming, then doing something that you know is going to make you feel really anxious may not feel like the right thing to do. My watch is talking. Can you hear that? Siri's talking to me on my watch. So yeah, so that's something, you know, you have to weigh up. But certainly there's some people who are using that time. And then the video calls themselves. I mean, as Amita said, this is challenging for people, but actually that does mean we have lots of opportunities. So for some people, they are kind of practicing things in the session with us virtually. And then again, remembering this as young people, they might have online lessons that they're supposed to be going to and they've not been going to, or they're keeping their camera off, or they're not really finding it very easy to FaceTime their grandparents because they really find it difficult to see their own image on the screen when they're doing that. And so we might, in a graded way, for some of them, they really want to be doing that. They want to be linking in. So we're using the exposure and the practice in the sessions, and then they're having things that they can practice outside of the sessions to really, yeah, I guess, take the opportunities of all of this online face-to-face contact that is available to be working on exposures. So sometimes we actually almost use the screen like we would a mirror. So when Amita touched on something called mirror retraining, which is, some of you may have tried before, which is about how you start to use the mirror in a slightly different way and try to avoid the honing in and the zoning in on specific areas and see your image as a whole and approach it in a kind of really neutral, non-judgmental way. It's a very quick summary of mirror retraining, but we can do that using the camera on the screen, and so it's almost as though we are the reflection and people are using the mirror and the image as sorry, the camera and the image as their mirror. So actually, you know, that's practically worked really well in lots of cases. And is, again, like I say, it's actually meaning then people are feeling more able to kind of do some of the online stuff that they need to be doing. So it has a real practical benefit for them. Let's see if anyone else has made any other suggestions before we plough on. I don't think so.
No, I guess I just wanted to say, sorry, going back to the previous slide, Kitty's just messaged with some further details. So I mentioned structured support groups as a way to access support, and that you could be thinking about some of these exposure tasks and so forth in that group. So just to let you know, we're gearing up for the third round of that. So 2 rounds have been done, and it'll be starting in the summer months. So it's going to be advertised via the BDD Foundation social media and the newsletter. So to look out for that, particularly as we know, we're not sure how long lockdown, even though they're saying about sort of restrictions being lifted a bit, but I don't know if, you know, treatment as usual will happen. And if you're not accessing CBT in a more kind of, you know, through NHS or private and so forth, that's a really good opportunity. So have a look out on the newsletter for the summer months. And I think, do we have some, I think people haven't come up with other ideas around exposures during lockdown, so perhaps we'll just kind of move on to some other things, just for people who are thinking about that. And then if we've got time, we'll come to these other comments. So Lauren, sorry, back over to you. I just kind of did
I run through these. So some of the BDD behaviours might be quite private ones. So, you know, I've talked so far, I guess, about things that involve the social aspect, so the being outside or the kind of using the camera and the online interactions. But actually some things may well be behaviours that you're doing on your own and when no one else is around. And, you know, they might be checking behaviours or things you're doing to try and reassure yourself, or things that you are doing, you know, generally in a repetitive way to try and reduce your anxiety. So actually any of those things might be appropriate to start trying to reduce. And what we found with lots of people is, unfortunately, BDD, as it tends to do, you know, loves to fill a vacuum. So because people have got less going on in terms of activities possibly, or in terms of interactions, you know, they have got lots of time at home on their own with very few distractions and things going on. And unfortunately for some people, that means that their time is being taken up with lots of ruminations and really unpleasant and distressing behaviours. And I think David's going to do a webinar on rumination in particular, isn't he? But in terms of the behaviours, you know, there might well be some things that we can work on in CBT, and in terms of, you know, really tackling those in an exposure way. So for example, I'm working with someone who's been working on keeping her hair tied up, and this isn't about other people seeing her. She just really struggles with having her hair tied back and knowing and of thinking and perceiving what that looks like. So for her, just sitting on her own in her room, she's been practicing every day having her hair tied back for a period of time, and she's finding that that's getting easier. So you know, there's lots of opportunities for things like that that you can be doing, even if you're not somebody who's going out of the house or is able to go out of the house. And I suppose linking into that idea of BDD taking up lots of time, it's also been important, I think, to help people to really think about how they can be spending their time in a kind of non-distressing way. So, you know, taking up hobbies and creative pursuits and things that you really enjoy and that you kind of get something positive out of doing, and trying as much as possible to have those things kind of scheduled into your time, and activities that are going to help you to kind of have that feeling of productivity and well-being. And some of those may well be things that you can then carry on once this lockdown's over. You know, this is again that reclaiming of life and rediscovering things that actually make you who you are and aren't about appearance. So I think social media, I guess we've kind of, I've touched on the online stuff, but yeah, just thinking about how you might use social media, and thinking about, you know, if you're taking photos and if perhaps so another person is certainly really worried about lighting. So we did our last exposure session, we were opening the curtains and trying to see if she could manage being in different lighting, and thinking about how photos are taken and the different, maybe reducing the photos you're taking, or maybe actually if you're avoiding that, managing to take a photo and sharing it with relatives. So there's lots of different opportunities for things like that. And then the final, for your reassurance seeking, if you are living with other people, it may be that you can work on reducing how often you ask them about your appearance, how often you check in with them to get reassurance about your appearance. And finally, imaginal exposure. So this is when you don't necessarily have exposure to the feared situation, but you just kind of run through in an imagery way, like what might happen. So it might be imagining walking into a big school canteen, or you know, being at a busy station, and really kind of describing exactly all of those things that would be happening. And often people say they really start to experience the anxiety if they're doing it in a really detailed way. And that's a really good first step before you actually try and go to that situation in real life. So this is the time where you could be working on those things in preparation for when we are able to have a bit more freedom and able to go out if people want to do that.
And I guess that's a nice segue into this final slide, just, you know, to try and keep some momentum with CBT whilst in lockdown, to sort of maintain sort of progress made, or to prepare for life after lockdown ends. And, you know, I think imaginal exposure is a really nice way of doing that if there are things that you're worried about, you know, when you're able to kind of mix in a bit more. But I hope what you've taken from what we've said is actually there's quite a lot of opportunities. I think sort of my initial reaction when we went into lockdown was, oh my goodness, you know, think about treatment. But actually, I think through the work that we're doing and as the weeks go on, there's so many opportunities to be challenging things if you feel like you're in the place to do that, or just to be trying to keep sort of things from slipping back. So lots of, I think with modern technology and so forth, and that hour walk, hour exercise we get a day, there's ways of using that in a way that can help you sort of keep on top of your BDD or challenge it further. And perhaps it is helpful to think about sort of what you might be trying to challenge and what that might kind of lead you to be able to do once social restrictions are reduced. So always kind of keeping it quite goal focused and kind of thinking, well, what does that mean I'll be able to do once this is over, and kind of thinking about the future. And I think that is all, what CBT is about as well. It's about sort of working towards your goals, and not to, we're in a really artificial, unusual time at the moment, but that isn't sort of, there is opportunities, as I've said, but also I think opportunities that then hopefully would segue when you're back into kind of whatever normal life will look like, to carry on challenging BDD. I'm just aware there have been a couple of kind of questions that have come up that have sort of linked with what we're talking about. I'm also just aware of the time, and I'm sorry, we just have the hour today, but if you would like a follow-up webinar on some of the things that we haven't addressed in your questions, or if you want another webinar about CBT or specific aspects of CBT that we haven't spoken about today, please do contact the BDD Foundation. We can arrange things. We're trying to do these every week. So sorry if we haven't got through to all of the questions. We tried to pick out sort of the most, the ones that came up first, so apologies for that. But we hope this has been helpful, and we hope that you will come back here again next week for David Veal, who will be talking about rumination, and again it'll be 7 p.m. Next week. And yeah, so just have please do check out the website. There'll be information about that, and you can email info@bddfoundation.org if you have ideas of future webinars that you think would be helpful for us to do. As I said, we are trying to do this every Wednesday evening at 7 p.m, so please do let us know, and we'll definitely try and kind of, we set up the ones that we thought people might want, but you're definitely going to have better ideas, so please do share. So thank you so much for attending today. We hope you found some of it helpful. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.